"You should be ashamed." Those words froze the room as Congresswoman Madeleine Dean confronted Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche over the Epstein files, demanding to know in front of cameras and the entire nation whether justice comes before loyalty. The air in the hearing room changed the moment she said it, because what Dean was about to expose wasn't just about bureaucratic delays or legal redactions. It was about a man who had been paid nearly $10 million to personally defend Donald Trump. Now sitting as the nation's top law enforcement officer, overseeing documents that may implicate Trump's own associates. And everyone in that room knew it. But here is what almost no one expected. Dean didn't just come with questions. She came with evidence she had copied by hand, one painstaking page at a time, from inside a locked government facility where phones are confiscated and electronics are banned. This wasn't political theater. This was a congresswoman doing what investigators refuse to do. Madeleine Dean is not the loudest voice in Congress. She is a former English professor who went to law school at 40. She became a state representative, then a congresswoman. She does not grandstand, she prepares. And before this hearing, she had visited the Department of Justice 3 separate times. She spent as many as 10 hours inside DOJ's secure review room, studying Epstein files under conditions that most Americans would find extraordinary. No phone, no electronics. She could take only handwritten notes. So she did, crouched over a table, transcribing what she could read through the heavy black redactions, scribbling furiously in the hallway when she ran out of space. She came to this hearing with 3 specific demands for Acting AG Todd Blanche. When will the remaining files be released? Why have no additional perpetrators been prosecuted? And does Blanche believe he has a conflict of interest as a man who collected nearly $10 million defending the same president whose connections run through these very documents? The exchange that followed was unlike anything that hearing room had witnessed in years. But before we get to the document that stopped the room cold, the one Dean pulled from her folder and read into the congressional record, you need to understand exactly who Todd Blanche is, and why his presence at that witness table is in itself the scandal. Blanche spent years as Trump's personal defense attorney. He earned roughly $10 million in legal fees representing the former and now current president. He built his reputation, his contacts, and his financial future inside the orbit of Donald Trump. And now, in a move that stunned legal observers across the political spectrum, he sits as Acting Attorney General of the United States. The man overseeing the Epstein files has a direct personal and financial bond with one of the most prominent names that may appear in those same files. Dean did not let this go unspoken. She looked directly at Blanche and said it plainly. You were paid $10 million to represent the president. You hang a 30-foot banner of the president's face over the entrance to the Department of Justice. You said that if you were terminated or not moved forward as Attorney General, you would say to the president, "I love you, sir." She paused just long enough for the weight to settle. So I have one question for you. Is your obligation to the victims and survivors of Epstein's heinous crimes, or is your first obligation to the President of the United States? Blanche's jaw tightened. His response was measured, professional, completely unconvincing. Without a doubt, he said, we want to bring justice to everything. Dean didn't blink. She fired straight back. When? The silence stretched across the room, and then things got worse for Todd Blanche. Dean revealed something that had not been disclosed publicly. During a private meeting at the Department of Justice, weeks before this hearing, Blanche had given her an explanation for why 3 million Epstein-related documents remain unreleased. According to Dean, Blanche told her that the documents were all duplicative and included materials about another man named Epstein. In other words, nothing to see here, don't worry about it, move along. Dean looked at Blanche across the hearing table and said it directly. That is what you said to me. Blanche stiffened. I did not say that. The room held its breath. This is now in the congressional record, a congresswoman under the rules of sworn oversight proceedings, accusing the acting attorney general of the United States of lying about a conversation that took place behind closed doors at the Department of Justice, and Blanche, under those same rules, denying it. One of them is not telling the truth, and Dean was not finished. She shifted to the redaction fight, the battle that has been quietly building for months and finally exploded in public view. Blanche insisted that all the black marks covering the documents exist for one reason only, to protect victims' names. The law required it, he said. The courts required it. That's why the files look the way they do. Dean's voice dropped a register. She held up a thick set of handwritten pages, her own notes, the ones she'd transcribed by hand in that hallway, and said, That prosecution memorandum talks about perpetrators, too. Blanche looked momentarily surprised. How do you know that? Dean didn't flinch. Talk to the victims. The implication was devastating. If the redactions are only protecting survivors, as Blanche claimed, then why are whole sections about potential co-conspirators blacked out? Why are investigators' findings about alleged perpetrators buried under layers of ink? Who, exactly, are those redactions designed to protect? Dean pressed harder. The American people are not stupid. They know that when members of Congress have to go in and physically hand-copy documents just to find the truth for these survivors, something is corrupt. Something is corrosive. And then came the moment that will be replayed for years. Dean opened her folder and produced a single document, a 2009 email, subject line Trump, sent by Jeffrey Epstein's own attorney, Jack Goldberger, directly to Epstein himself. It documented a phone conversation arranged specifically so that Trump could speak to lawyers without sitting for a formal deposition. Dean read it aloud into the congressional record, her voice steady and precise. Trump said he may have been on Epstein's plane, that he may have visited Epstein's property with his wife, that as far as he could recall, nothing beyond the ordinary had taken place. The room did not make a sound. This document was inside the Epstein files. It was redacted. Blanche's explanation for why. Attorney-client privilege. The communication between Epstein and his legal team, he said, was legally protected. And that is why it was blacked out. Not to shield survivors, not to protect the vulnerable, to protect a conversation between a convicted predator and his lawyers. Dean set down her notes and looked at Blanche one final time. Her voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. My only point is this. You are gravely conflicted. It is so obvious that you are gravely conflicted. These survivors deserve prosecutions. They deserved them years ago. And now it is in your lap. She added, with the precision of someone who has spent a decade choosing every word carefully. As Pam Bondi herself once said, they need an independent prosecutor. I hope you will do that. Here it is worth pausing, because Pam Bondi is not an innocent reference. She was the Attorney General who came before Blanche, who also stood before Congress and promised transparency, promised releases, promised justice, and then failed to deliver. Epstein file advocates watched Bondi's tenure end without the accountability she had publicly committed to, whether that was pressure from powerful interests, a failure of nerve, or something more deliberate. The outcome was the same. The files stayed buried, the perpetrators stayed unnamed, and the survivors were told to wait a little longer. Now Todd Blanche sits in that same chair, the question that Dean refused to leave unanswered, and that hangs over this hearing like a verdict not yet delivered, is whether Blanche's relationship with Trump represents a conflict so fundamental that no amount of careful legal language can paper over it. Because the Epstein files are not just about Epstein. They are about who knew him, who visited him, who benefited from the protection his network provided. And the acting attorney general has a documented financial, personal relationship with one of the most prominent names circling that investigation. Dean put it simply, is your first obligation to the victim or to the president? Blanche never gave a direct answer. He said the Department of Justice would always protect victims. He said they would prosecute anyone they could. He said the doors were open to survivors who came forward with information. He said all the right things, with the smooth delivery of a man who has spent decades inside courtrooms, shaping narratives, managing impressions. But Dean had already made her point. She didn't need a confession. She needed the public to see the contradiction with their own eyes. A man, paid by Trump, now controlling Trump-adjacent files, telling the survivors of a decades-long criminal network that his loyalties are not divided. The chairman cut her off before her time was officially up. She had to argue, publicly, on the record, for 20 seconds back. Even then, she was denied the chance to formally enter her copied documents into the committee record, a procedural move that, to many observers watching the exchange, felt less like order and more like protection. Consider for a moment what it took for that document to reach the public record. Dean did not receive it through a formal disclosure. She did not obtain it through a subpoena or a FOIA request that was actually honored. She read it off a binder inside a locked room with no phone and no scanner, copying what she could see through the redactions, transcribing shorthand in a hallway, and then stood up in a congressional hearing and read it into the permanent record of the United States government. That is the level of obstruction these investigators are working against. That is the institutional wall that survivors have been pressing against for more than a decade. And now, the man guarding that wall once said on record that if he was not kept in his position, he would call the president and say, "I love you, sir." That is not a conflict of interest. That is a conflict of identity. Dean's instincts as a former English professor matter here more than people realize. She knows what words mean. She knows the difference between we complied with the law and we released everything. She knows the difference between we protect victims and we pursue perpetrators. And when Blanche deployed the language of justice without the substance of it, she didn't let it pass. She pressed every clause, challenged every evasion, and named what she was seeing, directly, under oath, with documentation in her hand. It is worth noting that Blanche did not lose his composure during this exchange. He remained composed, lawyerly, precise. He is very good at what he does, but there is a particular kind of calm that comes from practice, and a particular kind of silence that comes from having no good answer. What the cameras captured was not the confidence of a man with nothing to hide. It was the trained stillness of a man navigating a room he no longer controlled. And Dean knew it. Madeleine Dean left that hearing room with her handwritten pages, her 3 unanswered questions, and a 2009 email now permanently embedded in the congressional record. Todd Blanche left with his title intact, for now. But the question she asked him is not going away. Who do you serve? And here is the question we're leaving for you, because this conversation belongs to everyone watching right now. Do you think Todd Blanche will be more transparent and just on the Epstein files than Pam Bondi was? Or will powerful names once again find a way to silence the people asking the hardest questions? Drop your answer below, because the comment section on this one is going to tell us everything.